Hello and welcome to the Liz Earle Wellbeing Show. I'm Liz Earle and I will be speaking with leading experts and familiar faces from the whole world of wellbeing to bring you wellness wisdom you can really trust. From fitness to gut health, mood to menopause, you'll quickly learn how to spot a gem of wellness wisdom from a passing fad. Now, I have just had the most fascinating conversation about climate change, food, farming, and so much more with Patrick Holden CBE, a British farmer and global activist doing brilliant work to campaign for sustainable farming. Now, he led the Soil Association for 15 years, playing a leading role in the development of the UK organic market. And we chatted about the early origins of the organic movement, the importance of healthy soil. That's its name, isn't it? And why the cheapest foods on supermarket shelves really aren't that cheap at all. And like me and so many others, if you endeavour to eat in a way that's both healthy and sustainable, then this really is the episode for you. Patrick is the real deal. He knows it all, and I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on our conversation over on Instagram. Do leave me a comment after the show. Don't forget, if you like to watch Patrick and me chatting, you will also find this interview on the Liz Earle Wellbeing YouTube channel. Do tune in, and without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. So Patrick, I am so thrilled that you are here, that you've made time, because you are just everywhere. You're on every airwave, on the TV channels, talking about food, farming, sustainability, regenerative agriculture, all the things that are so front of mind at the moment.
Well, we're doing our best, but I think our voice is needed.
Yeah.
Because in the debate, there's a great deal of confusion around the question, which I think is at the back of everyone's minds today. What should I eat to be healthy and sustainable?
You're absolutely right. Now, you and I go back a long way. We should just say we've known each other for
maybe 25 years.
25 years? Yeah.
Back to when I was running the Soil Association. I think it was probably in the 90s when we met. It might have even been the 80s, but I think it was probably the 90s. It
may well have been 80s, because I started writing about food and well-being and nutrition and beginning to be interested in the organic movement long before I became an organic farmer, but just as a bystander and just wanting to be an advocate for something that was so clearly, obviously, the right way to go.
I remember when we first met, you said you wanted to become an organic farmer.
Did I really say that?
You did.
And now I am. I mean, for the last 12 years. And it's been a very interesting journey, because I now understand more. I don't understand it all, but I understand more of what it's like to be a farmer and to cope with the complexities of DEFRA and soil health and all the rest of it that comes into it, which is so important when you're trying to eat from farm to fork, as we talk about now, that whole kind of process. But let's rewind a little bit. Your history, did you grow up in a farming family?
I did not. I'm a Londoner.
Are you?
I grew up in Dulwich and then Hadley Wood. My father was training to be a doctor, and he eventually became a child psychiatrist. But along the road, we moved a lot, because that's what doctors do when they're training. And one of my most important childhood episodes was a year in a Hertfordshire village in the 50s. So this was pre-agricultural intensification. And I had the wildest of times just roaming around collecting birds' eggs, because you could, it was legal then, and chloroforming butterflies. And I think I made no impact whatsoever on the biodiversity, because it was just so profuse.
Yeah.
And what was interesting was I witnessed food production in harmony with nature.
Yeah.
And that has all disappeared subsequently. And rather like a frog in water that you heat gently, those of us that weren't around at that time might not realise that what we've lost.
Yeah.
So I bore witness to another age when there was biodiversity in harmony with nature and food production. And I believe that's what's got to come back. And because I farmed all my life since I left London and got back to the land as a hippie.
So you literally went from college as a hippie, is that right?
Well,
was that your journey?
My dad was posted out to the San Francisco Bay Area to Stanford University at a very important time, 1970, 71. So I kind of went out there and drank a bit of Kool-Aid, metaphorically speaking, of course, and came back.
Age what?
20.
Right.
And I came back convinced that we were on the edge of an ecological breakdown, and the sensible thing to do was to form a commune with my friends and get back to the land and live happily ever after, farming in harmony with nature. And that's actually what we did. But before I did that, I needed to train, obviously, and get a little bit of experience in agriculture. So I studied biodynamic farming at a college in Sussex,
Did
and I
you?
also got a job on an intensive dairy farm in Hampshire for a year, and that was my training.
Wow. So the intensive dairy farming compared to biodynamic farming, I mean, polar opposite, are we talking?
Yeah, but farming is still farming, and I probably learnt as much on the intensive dairy farm. I say intensive, it was only relatively intensive in those
Right.
days.
Yeah.
But I learnt as much in that year as I did and have probably in any one year subsequently by just practice. And I think what's missing from all this debate amongst all the NGO community and all the other academics who are producing all these reports is that very few of them actually have any experience of practical farming.
Yeah. Our
And that's
farming. Yeah.
yeah, and that's why it's important that our voice is heard because
Yes.
we're the voice of practice and sustainable practice, and that's been missing.
Well, you not only have a long history, obviously, as an amazing farmer, but you then went on to lead the Soil Association. And it grew from, I mean, under your leadership, it grew from what, how many staff to the size when you left? It was
Well,
huge.
when I first joined the council, which was 1981, I think there were 3 or 4 people employed, and they were still based in Suffolk, which is where Lady E. Balfour founded it,
Yeah.
at her farm, actually. And then a great friend of mine called Peter Seger, he also joined the council, and we started sort of shaking things up. We were known as the Young Turks by the sort of old guard.
How brilliant.
And we were disruptors, really, because we had the audacious idea of developing a market for sustainably produced food. Because until then, it was more of a philosophy than a marketplace.
So you didn't go to the supermarket and buy organic food as such?
There were hardly any organic products out there. There were no
Right.
livestock standards. There were embryonic standards for vegetables. But we realised that we needed to make a living. If we wanted to put our principles into practice, we'd have to develop a separate market because at that time, if you farmed and produced grain and milk in an intensive way, you got a guaranteed price for every litre or tonne that you produced. Whereas we were trying to farm in harmony with nature, not using any chemicals. We pretty soon found out that you couldn't make as much money that way. So we had this bright idea of developing a separate market, which meant we had to define the standards of production. They
Right.
were the organic standards. And it was assigned to me to write what became the world's first draft of the organic dairy farming standards.
So you are pretty much the godfather of organic food in
No.
our supermarket, no?
No, the organic movement predated my birth. Lady Eve Balfour, the founder of the Soil Association, she was the niece of Prime Minister Balfour, and she read a book by a man called Sir Albert Howard, who'd been inspired by the agriculture of the Hunza Valley, now part of Pakistan in northwest India, in the early part of the 20th century. And because he realised he was a British scientist knighted for his services to agricultural research, sent out at the height of the empire to teach the Indian farmers how to adopt Western methods. And when he got there, he had the humility to realise that they knew more than he did. So he stayed there for 35 years studying their agriculture.
Wow, and he brought that back.
He brought it back and he wrote a book called An Agricultural Testament, which was published in 1940, which was his homage to the Indian farmers that he referred to as his professors.
Isn't that amazing? I didn't know that.
And that led to Lady E. Balfour setting up the Soil Association. And for the first 30 years, I wasn't involved at all. And then at the end of the 70s, because we were farming by then, I became interested in their work. And Lady Eve's original idea was that it was necessary to build a body of informed public opinion about the link between farming practice, food quality, and human health. She was absolutely right, and there's still a lot of work to do today, and that's probably part of the reason why it's good that we're discussing this.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting that it's called the Soil Association. It's not the Food Association or the Organic Association, because it starts with the soil, doesn't it?
Exactly. Albert Howard said that the health of soil, plants, animals, and people is one and indivisible. So if we want to promote the health of the plants, then we need to first look after the biological health of the soil and so on down the chain. And we are, as it were, what we eat.
Yes,
Eight.
or exactly what we are. I mean, I often say that actually, it's not only what we are, what we eat, but we are what we eat has eaten.
Exactly. And that goes back to the soil, which is the stomach of the plant.
Yeah, it's the food for the plant. So whatever you feed your plants is going to end up in the plant. Like
Exactly.
whatever we feed ourselves is going to help or not, or hinder how we develop as humans.
Yes, and the soil, the plants have this incredible symbiotic relationship with a community of bacteria and fungi
Yeah.
that exist in their root zones, and they spend a third of their photosynthetic energy exuding sugary sap to nourish these organisms because they cannot digest the organic matter in the soil without them. And that is the equivalent, if you think about it, of our stomach. We depend in our own stomachs on a community of bacteria which coexist with us and outnumber the number of cells in our body
Yeah.
for our digestion. It's
Yeah.
the same with plants, except their stomach is externalized. It is the soil.
In the roots. And by putting back into the soil, they are fertilizing the soil with their own microbes. And then, I mean, we can come on and talk about things like nitrogen fixes in the soil with clovers and obviously ruminant animals and all of that. But it is so interesting, isn't it, that the attention finally, I think, is turning to the soil and soil erosion and carbon capture and all of those things that are so important in the soil. So when you left the Soil Association, how big was it? It had gone from 4 to how many?
About 200.
That's
And
amazing.
yes, it was a period of great growth, and the market was, I think it peaked in 2008 at around 2.65 billion. And since then it's declined. Billion, yes. So it went from 250,000 or something like that to 2.6 billion. And then that coincided with the recession. And because of the lack of public understanding about the reasons why it was a good thing to support organic food in the marketplace and organic farming, plus the apparently high cost discrepancy between normal conventional food and organic food, the market actually declined. It's now back to growth, but it did decline for some years.
Yeah.
I'd like
And-
to say after I left the Soil Association,
Well-
but I think that's not really the reason.
Well, I mean, I've sat in conferences with you and others working in this area, and it's interesting that you talk about the cost of food, because of course what we don't seem to be doing is accounting for the true cost. You know, so much of our intensively produced food is subsidised, and we pay higher water rates, for example, to clear up the watercourses because they've been so polluted with pesticide runoffs and nitrates and all of that. And I know that's something that you've been working on because you left the Soil Association to found the Sustainable Food Trust.
That's right. I felt there were a number of circumstances which led to my decision to leave, but one of them was that by developing a separate market for sustainably produced food, there were some unintended consequences. We polarized the farming community. Those that weren't farming organic felt as if we were somehow demonizing them, and we were separating the two communities. That wasn't desirable. But I think there's another factor which has become much more pressing today, which is that we now know that unless we transform the whole of the world's food systems to more sustainable production, we're going to tip into irreversible climate change. So now the project is not to transform a niche market and a small percentage of agriculture, it's the whole of agriculture. And for that, we need a new approach, a more inclusive approach, and a bigger vision. And the Sustainable Food Trust, which is only a small organisation, probably about a tenth of the size of the Soil Association, is working catalytically to bring together people in leadership positions throughout the world, but also in the UK, to see if we can accelerate a change that is trying to happen but is being held back. And as you rightly say, one of the key reasons for that is the absence of true cost accounting. In other words, when we look at so-called cheap food in a supermarket today, it appears cheap, but in reality, there are hidden costs associated with its production which are not on the price label. And we're here.
But we're paying for them anyway.
We're paying for them in hidden ways. And we produced a report which you can download from our website called The Hidden Costs of UK Food. And the headline conclusion of it is that for every pound you spend on food in a shop, there's another hidden pound in damage to the environment, destruction of soil, biodiversity, nitrates getting into the watercourses, and damage to public health, which is split 50-50 between damage to the environment and public health, which, if you factored that in, would make the food not cheap at all, but actually rather expensive. But because we don't see that, the temptation is to buy the cheaper food, even though these hidden costs are actually being paid for, as you say already, in our taxes or in other ways.
Yeah. It does seem like you are trying to move an enormous boulder up a very steep hill when you talk about changing global agriculture. How optimistic are you that these things are achievable?
I am quite optimistic, actually, because I think the climate change community have finally realised that if we are to avoid a reversible climate change, agriculture is in the front line of what needs to be addressed. And I'm saying that because a woman called Vandana Shiva, Dr. Vandana Shiva, who's a great Indian campaigner, said in a talk that I heard the other day that whereas it used to be the rainforests and the areas of pristine wilderness that were the lungs and the digestive system of the planet, now, because we've destroyed so much of that natural habitat, it is the farms of the world that are its lungs and its stomach, if you like, as we just said. And if the patient is sick, and I'm afraid global agriculture is sick, then the planet is sick and we are sick. And that's the truth of the situation we find ourselves in. So we have to transform our food and farming systems. We now have the support of the climate change community. And I think more and more people involved, for instance, with public health, who are facing health service treatment costs, which are threatening to bankrupt our country, are beginning to realise that actually the primary contributor to public health is a healthy agriculture. And we need to make these connections and get out of our silos.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly healthy food and making those choices. And, we'll come on and we'll talk about the meat versus plant-based debate in a moment. But I'd like to stay with soil and agricultural practices for the moment. One of the things that's annoyed me, and when I look on Twitter, which I do periodically, and there are a lot of vocal people talking for both sides of the debate here, is that there doesn't seem to be any separation or reference to the type of agriculture, because all farming, as you pointed out, is not the same.
Exactly.
And it can be vastly different. And in some areas, you can be capturing carbon in the soil and, by using grazing animals, for example. And in other areas, releasing huge amounts of it and eroding it and cutting down rainforests to grow soya. So can you give us just a snapshot overview here between the good guys and the bad guys?
Well, as you rightly say, we need to differentiate between the farming systems and the food products which are part of the problem and those which are part of the solution. So in a way, we have to become expert in this. And that might sound challenging, but we can make the description of the changes that are necessary and the actions we need to take simple, because it is quite simple. And we are all extremely interested in this because we all eat.
We all eat and we all want to have a planet to live on.
Exactly. So there's rather a lot hanging on this.
So what are your top line points that we should adopt as consumers?
Well, we've been in a chapter of agriculture which has involved, it's really been an asset stripping operation, an asset stripper of nature's capital. We've now got our soil carbon levels down to critical low points. The biodiversity from which used to coexist, as I just described, has gone. We're polluting the atmosphere with greenhouse gases from agriculture, and we're using pesticides which are contaminating our water and also damaging our health. And that chapter of chemically based agriculture has to end, and it needs to give way to a new chapter based on biology, not chemistry. And that involves the regeneration of the natural capital that we've destroyed. And I can say, because I've been farming that way for over 40 years, that the system does work and it could feed the world, but we would have to adjust our diets accordingly to align them, our future diets, with the productive capacity of the sustainable farming systems, which need to replace the industrial ones that we have at the moment. And in that question is probably another bit of our discussion. So in other words, what should we eat if we were to align our future diets, assuming that we are not, of course, some people are going vegan and vegetarian, and that's fine if you've got ethical objections. But I would contest that you don't need to do that. But you do need to be discerning about which livestock products you eat.
So which are the good ones? And I have to hold my hand up here. I have a vested interest. I am a grass-fed farmer, pasture farmer. And I do passionately believe in regenerative agriculture and capturing carbon in the soil by grazing animals and having, ruminants, especially in the UK. We don't have the landscape, do we, to grow acres and acres of arable crops. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. In some countries they do, but certainly in the UK we don't. And they are they seem very efficient. You have sheep in the field who eat grass and turn that into something that we can't eat while they're capturing carbon in the soil and regenerating it into something that we can there's no input. I mean, certainly on our farm, we don't feed our sheep anything other than the grass that grows out of the ground. Very occasionally a little bit of hard feed if the winter's very hard, but that's very rare.
Yes, I think you're onto something important here, which is the grain production is actually quite ecologically expensive. You know, if you plough the fields and sow them with, cultivate the seed beds, sow them with grain, and then wait and harvest them with a combine, there's a lot of fossil fuel involvement and a lot of activity. And when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s, the grain which came from those systems, which were part of mixed farming, as I described, were quite expensive. So a chicken was a treat that we had once a month, because a grain-fed chicken came from that relatively expensive farming system, whereas the staple meat was grass-fed lamb and beef, because that was actually cheaper to produce for the reasons you've just described. But unfortunately, because of chemistry and the use of herbicides and pesticides and fungicides and nitrogen fertilizer, we've vastly increased the output of grains, but we've done so at the expense of the soil and the environment. But the price on the grain has been cheap, and that has meant that you can go into a supermarket and buy a chicken for whatever it is, £4 or £3.50
it's
or
absolutely,
something.
it's crazy. And am I right in saying that it takes, is it 5 kilos of grain to produce 1 kilo of chicken?
It's
That
even
sort
less
of-
than that now.
Is it?
Yes, it's and the point is that people who argue in favour of chicken consumption as opposed to beef consumption will say, well, it's very efficient because the birds grow so quickly these days. But actually, if you factor in the damage that's done in the soya production, for instance, which is, you know, part of the destruction of the Brazilian rainforest,
Yes, to feed the chickens.
and all the pesticides, and also the welfare implications.
Yeah,
and
terrible
the-
of a fast-growing chicken, battery farmed, intensively reared.
and also the fat composition of the chickens. In fact, grass-fed lamb and beef has got a far better balance of omega-3, omega-6 fatty acids than industrial chicken production.
That's
You put all
crazy,
that
isn't it?
together,
Yeah.
you look at the antibiotics, which are
Yes.
used as growth promoters or disease suppressants in equal measure,
Yeah.
and it's just an unsustainable system. And if we really saw how horrendous it was with, you know, cameras in the sheds and everything,
Yeah.
we wouldn't want to eat it.
No.
And yet, more and more of us are eating chicken. And I was just in a cafe talking to some people from one of the conservation organizations this afternoon. And I said to the woman I was talking to, if we did a sort of, you know, survey of all the young people sitting in this cafe and said, if I said to them, do you eat meat? And if they said they weren't vegetarian or vegan and they said yes, I'd say, well, which do you think is the least bad meat to eat if you've got a bit of a conscience about climate change, etc.,
Yeah.
etc.? They would all say chicken. They think that if they're going to eat a meat at all, it would be chicken, because that's what's come across from all the recent debate in the press about the right meat to eat, because it's claimed that there are lower emissions from chicken than there are from, say, grass-fed beef animals.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about that, but in fact, the right meat to eat, if you want to be healthy and sustainable, is grass-fed ruminant meat. That means lamb or beef or possibly dairy products from mainly grass-fed animals, which are what I do on my farm.
Yeah.
And that message has not got across to the public at
No,
all.
and chicken's got a very kind of healthy image and a very sort of clean wrap, if you like. And similarly for pork, is that being fed a lot of hard feed?
I'm afraid pork's another dreadful story.
Is it?
All the intensive pigs that are
Yeah.
reared these days are all grain-fed, soya and all the rest of it. They are part of the problem. It is possible to have delicious, healthy pork. It should be fed on, as it were, leftovers or waste, and part of the circular economy. So you try to feed pigs on, well, it used to be swill.
Yes,
but
from
products,
schools and places like that back
On
in the day, but when you are allowed.
yeah, or whey from a cheese-making operation. That's what we do with
Oh,
our
right,
house
okay.
pigs.
Yeah.
They love whey. They go mad for whey.
Do they?
And the native breeds, which are very good at putting on fat, and of course the flavours in the fat,
Yeah.
which have all sort of gone out of fashion since this ridiculous trend towards lean meat became mainstream.
Yeah.
They basically are the best way to produce really delicious pork. And again, that ought to be quite expensive and a treat, but
Yes.
it absolutely should form part of a sustainable diet. But once again, we have to differentiate between the industrial pig systems where the pigs never get outside
Yes,
and
terrible.
they're dreadfully treated, and we should give up eating that pork altogether and the chicken, and instead switch our loyalty to the farm animals which are absolutely necessary and part of a sustainable farming system.
Why are beef and lamb, sheep, why are cows and sheep so important on the land? Why is it important to have pasture grazing at all?
Well, one interesting statistic is that 2/3 of the whole farmed land area of the United Kingdom is grassland. And much of that grassland could not grow crops. For instance, on my farm in Wales, it's steep and it rains a lot and the soils are fragile. And we do have a rotation where we do grow some crops. We used to grow carrots and we still grow grain. But we can only probably grow those arable crops 2 years in 7. And so for the rest of the time, the other 5 years of the rotation, it's grass. So if we want to produce food from Wales, from the grasslands of Wales, that means either dairy cows or beef animals or sheep. And for the farmers in the arable east, so now if you drive, as I went on a train today from Northampton down to London, it was just wall-to-wall arable crops. And back in the 50s, that was still mixed farming because they were not using nitrogen, fertilizer and pesticides, so they had to have a crop rotation. And all the arable farmers in the east now are reporting that their soils are dead and they've got no organic matter left in them. And they're looking at what to do about that. And we are saying to them, well, what you need to do is to go back into a mixed farming system with a crop rotation, a fertility building phase and all the rest of it. And they're saying, well, why would I do that when everybody is giving up eating red meat? And if I did that, I wouldn't make any money out of half of my rotation. So we are saying, yes, unfortunately, you're right. So the challenge is to communicate to the public about the difference between the unsustainable meat, which is the chicken and the pork, and the sustainable meat, which is the grass-fed beef and lamb, which is absolutely necessary for those arable farmers to go back into a regenerative farming system. And if we support them by buying their products in the marketplace, then they can make the change that's necessary to address climate change.
And this is literally capturing carbon in the soil. It is making a tangible difference to when we talk about greenhouse gases and emissions. So I know cows get a bad rap because people say, oh, they just release methane and they're contributing to climate change. But actually, they are capturing more in the soil. Isn't that right?
It is right. It's been estimated that if all the world's cropping soils were to shift back to a proper sustainable farming rotation, which involved fertility building with clover and grass or other leguminous crops, we could probably take up to 100 parts per million of CO2 out of the atmosphere and re-sequester it in the soil carbon bank. And that is the only area where addressing climate change could actually reverse the greenhouse gas emissions which we've contributed to through the burning of fossil fuels. So this is a really exciting story.
That's phenomenal. And that's with cows.
With cows and sheep.
Cows and sheep, we do that.
And let's just sort of deal with the methane issue, because it is true that ruminant animals, cows and sheep, do emit methane, but that is part of an ancient cycle that's been around as long as there were herbivores on the planet. And if you look at some of the most fertile soils in the world, the soils of the Great Plains, for instance, in America, the Corn Belt, they were all built with an interaction of bison and grassland. So millions of herbivores roamed these great prairies, ate the grass, dunged and urinated on it, trampled on it, and emitted methane, which has a short life, only 12 or 13 years, and then it degrades. That's all
but
part
they were capturing, they were capturing the carbon in the soil. And if they were doing this thousands of years ago, way before climate change, and there were millions of them.
And it's part of an old carbon cycle. The new methane is fossil fuel derived, I'm afraid. And the inconvenient truth is that we've demonized livestock, possibly to salve our consciences about our expensive flying and travelling habits. And I'm part of that too. We're all part of this.
But the emissions there are way, way more.
They are. And the truth is we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels. It's going to be painful, but that's the really big change that needs to happen.
I'm interested in the whole plant-based debate here, because when we look at it from an agricultural point of view, if you have got these vast prairies, whether you're talking about the east of England or the prairies in the Midwest or wherever in America, then you are, and I've seen the video footage of the combine harvesters, the fertilizers, the ploughing that's going up of the topsoil. Every time you're ploughing a field, presumably you are releasing the carbon that's been captured there.
Yes.
It's just going up into the environment. So surely growing plants is far more destructive when you talk about climate change than sequestering carbon by having grazing animals on it.
Well, regenerative agriculture can rebuild soil carbon, and that I would say is a process which is going to heal some of the damage we've done to the soils.
So we can rebuild it with the animals.
Yes, and no, it would be wrong to suggest that agriculture is a zero-sum game. I mean, obviously, if you rewilded the whole of the planet, this would probably be the most dramatic way to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. But then, unfortunately,
We wouldn't have anything to eat.
human come lately wouldn't have a lot to eat.
Okay.
So we have to somehow strike a balance.
Yeah.
And the question is, can we strike a balance by producing food working in harmony with nature? And I can report back from the farm that this is possible because
Yeah.
we've been doing it, and we could get so much better at doing it. I mean, we've been farming over 40 years on our farm in West Wales. I still feel that I've learned things about soil grazing management, holistic grazing, just in the last few years that make me realise I'm just at the beginning of what can be achieved.
Yeah.
So if we set ourselves the task of adopting regenerative agriculture globally and locally, and we are loyal to the farmers that we need to support by buying their products, preferably near to where we live, then the world could change. And this is a story of hope.
Well, I really hope so. And I'm an ambassador for Love British Food. So I'm very much about supporting British farmers. And I live in a farming community on an active working farm. So it is a subject very close to my heart. And I get very annoyed, particularly when people throw in brickbats about methane emissions, for example, and demonising cows, when producing rice produces 5 times more methane. Not to mention the nitrous oxide that comes from the paddy fields. I mean, but we don't think about that when we tuck into our, veggie dishes that are full of rice. Oh, this is bad for the environment.
That's right. And I think, in discussing and arriving at a conclusion about what we should eat to be sustainable and healthy, we should be as rigorous in our scrutiny about plants as we are about animals.
Oh, completely. I mean, your point about local eating, I mean, if you are going to be plant-based or vegan, vegetarian, and have more plants, it seems to me it's very dominated by things like avocados imported, quinoa imported, beans, Californian almonds imported. Was it 1 litre of water to produce 1 almond?
Exactly.
Not to mention the hundreds of thousands of bees that they kill in the process each year.
If we were deriving 80% of our dietary fats from animals at the beginning of the 20th century, and
That's a staggering figure, isn't it? I still can't get over that.
Yeah, and now it's reversed. Then we have to ask ourselves, where are the plant fats coming from? And if they're coming from unsustainable systems, then we need to be as tough on that as we are on the livestock. So it's all very well saying eat less but better meat. Well, that's fine, but we should apply the same principle to plants.
Yes.
Which plants should we eat? We should eat the plants which are grown near to us in a sustainable way, which can nourish us. And that leads me to another point, which is that I just learned a couple of weeks ago that some farmers in New England, second-generation organic farmers, interestingly enough, have come across and developed a spectrometer, which is used for measuring the elemental content of planets and distant stars, which have now been developed in an app on an Android phone, which can analyse the nutrient density of food.
I love that. So we can take this app to the food store and see what nutrients it contains.
Well, they did exactly that. They took some carrot seed.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
They sent, I think they got a kilogram of carrot seed, and they sent it to 100 carrot growers of varying types. So some of them are intensive, some are organic. And they said, grow this carrot seed and send the carrots back to us. And then they used this device, which I haven't yet seen, but we've ordered one. I think it's $700 on an Android phone. And they analysed the nutrient differences between the various carrots of the different systems. And apparently there were staggering differences in the nutrient content, because they're all urged to eat 5 a day, as if that was, the thing that you could do to transform your health. Turns out that the changes in vegetable production practice, which have taken place again during my farming lifetime, have compromised the nutrient density of just about all the vegetables we buy in supermarkets. It's very difficult. If you go into a supermarket today and you try to buy good vegetables, I would say it's virtually impossible. If you've got an organic range, they'll definitely be better. But the changes in farming practice have really diminished the micronutrient content of all the vegetables.
That's so fascinating.
And if you buy salads now in a UK supermarkets, they will no longer be grown in soil, any of them.
What?
So if you buy lettuce, peppers,
So where are their nutrients coming from then?
they're all grown hydroponically in rock wool in a nutrient solution of nitrogen and phosphate and then the other key essential micronutrients which are just diluted in water. So it's rather like feeding a patient with a stomach tube. We bypass the soil. And of course there are going to be long-term nutritional consequences from that. But I think what is really exciting about this tool is that it may empower us to start to measure the food productivity in a new way, nutrition per acre, not just yield per acre.
Yes.
And that would empower citizens in their role as consumers to use their buying power in a new way. Because I think the supermarkets, I mean, I'll be absolutely honest, you go into a supermarket these days knowing what we know, and you try to buy good food.
It's
very
really hard.
difficult.
It's tough.
It's very difficult. I mean, there are, I buy organic milk. I go down to my local small-scale supermarket, and when I'm desperate, which I often am, because we're like that.
Yeah, for sure.
And I try to buy something which I think is okay, and I might get some smoked mackerel or something like that, and reluctantly buy some fruit and vegetables because I know it's not very nutrient rich, and I'll get some organic milk and things like that. But then I run out. And everything else is just heavily processed and degraded. The bread's probably rubbish because supermarkets don't sell good bread.
No, and even, I was doing a podcast recently on the scandal of sourdough and about how the labelling regulations are being engineered so that it doesn't have to be real sourdough at all and it can still be called sourdough. I mean, the whole thing is such a minefield.
It is, but actually, once again, we need to be discerning. We need to understand what the sourdough process is and why slow bread, we're making slow cheese on our farm.
Tell me about slow cheese.
Well, it's the equivalent really of sourdough because most modern cheddars are made using very aggressive, fast-acting bacteria, which then enable the cheddar makers to make a cheese in perhaps just 2 or 3 hours. Whereas if you put a culture with more diversity into the milk, and you put less of it in the milk, and you use raw milk, not pasteurized milk, then the process is much slower and much more gentle, and the flavors are much more subtle and complex, and you get more of the flavor of the farm itself, the biome of the farm, which stays in the cheese.
So you get a better beneficial bacteria load in these slower growing, sort of almost fermented cheeses.
Yes, it is. It is fermentation. It's exactly that. And of course, we now know that sourdough bread is much healthier for us. And if you look at
much more easy to digest.
Yeah, and if you look at all the rises in gluten intolerance and all the allergies that are so prevalent today, I'm absolutely certain that the cause of this goes back to 2 things at least. One is agricultural intensification and the other is heavy processing of food. And if we were to move towards more natural processing methods, including sourdough and slow cheese, and also we were to move back towards regenerative agriculture, avoiding the use of chemicals, then many of these food intolerances would disappear. And I heard a fascinating story the other day at Ballymaloe Cookery School.
Great, in Cork, Dorina Allen. Yeah.
So Dorina told me just the other day, she's an old friend of mine, she said, we get about 20% of all the pupils who do our 12-week courses at Ballymaloe arrive at the school with food intolerances. And with the exception of celiacs, all of them disappear by the end of the course because all the food that they cook in their kitchens is grown on their organic farm. Isn't that fascinating?
That is fascinating. And it doesn't surprise me because I wrote a book a few years ago called The Good Gut Guide. And I am very anti the rise of free from foods. You go into any supermarket these days, you've got these big aisles, free from gluten, free from lactose, free from this, free from that. And it's like, no, you don't need to be buying free from. You need to work out why your gut is reacting in a way that it is to the modern ultra-processed foods that you're eating. And I've just got a little 6-week plan. And when people follow that, similar to being at the Dorina Allen Cookery School, you're eating sourdough bread, which is fermented, you're having your natural yogurts or your raw milks or whatever, and your gut rebalances and you can then start eating these foods again. And my niece, who is gluten intolerant, she went on that exact program and now she eats pizza. And whereas before she was spending a fortune on buying gluten-free rubbish.
Exactly. And as a dairy farmer, it's very interesting because in a way one's conducting a daily feeding trial, which you can't do with people because, you can't control everything we do or we can't control everything we do. Whereas with cows, you turn the cows into a new field or you would give them some hay or silage or whatever you're feeding them, and you can observe the impact on their poo, of course, because that's their digestive system, and cow poo is lovely.
In what way is cow poo lovely?
Well, it's vegan, and it's also, it smells delicious.
Does
and
it?
if the cows are eating good food,
Okay.
the bacteria are beneficial bacteria. It's all part of a healthy biome. And what is interesting about our cows is that we're feeding them more or less 100% from the food that is grown on our farm. This is obviously an ecosystem which has been going for a long time, decades, and for the last year, we didn't have a single case of mastitis in our dairy cows. Now that, if you're a dairy farmer, that
remarkable.
is something.
Yeah.
And that is to do with the udder health of the cows, which is directly connected with their nutrition.
Yeah.
And there's something incredibly powerful about that when you witness that the health of a cow. And another thing that always amazes me, if you turn the cows into a field of really good grass, and every field is different, it's got a different terroir about it, you can see within 12 hours of them going into a field with really rich grass, there will be a bloom on their coats and the milk yield will go up. It's that rapid because cows, got a fast-forwarded metabolism compared to ours. So this is like, you're a daily witness to the connection between food quality and health when you have the privilege of milking cows, which I still do.
Yeah, and connecting that back to the soil. Interesting that you were saying that the cows, your cows and grass-fed cows, are eating virtually everything that's grown in the field. So this myth about the rainforest being cut down to produce soya to feed cows is not the case, certainly not for British agriculture.
There's no reason why our future dairy herd couldn't be nourished mainly from the soil of our lands, including the grains. So what we're
do you grow your own maize if you want to feed maize?
Well, we're growing a mixture of oats, barley, and peas. It used to be called dredged corn in old farming language, and we combine it in one. So we've got a bin full of oats, peas, and barley, and we mill it on a daily basis. So it's freshly milled every day, and it looks like
gourmet food for your cows.
It does look like muesli.
Really?
And the cows love it. They like the taste of the soil that they live on.
Yeah.
It's interesting. They really go for it. So we do buy in organic cake, as it's called in dairy farming circles. And that's about 50% of the concentrate feed that the cows still eat, although we're trying to go 100% grown on our farm. But they actually prefer the grains grown on our farm because they taste more,
It's just homegrown, like homemade.
Yeah.
Tastes better.
We don't, these days, we eat globally, don't we? We go and buy in a supermarket. We don't really know where the food came from. It probably comes from all over the world. So we're literally consuming the food from 1,000 farmers in 5 different continents almost every day. Yeah. And I think we don't want to be ideological about it, but I think as a direction of travel, it would be better if a greater proportion of our staple foods was grown from farmers that we know who live and farm near to us. Yeah. And so that should be our commitment as when we buy food, to look for that and to go into a supermarket. Because let's be honest, we are more powerful than the supermarkets. We think the supermarkets are powerful. They're not. They're just slaves to our preferences. So we are the powerful ones. We are the cell in the food system. Think of it that way. And if enough of us change, the supermarkets will have to change because otherwise they will go out of business.
Well, I hope you're right, Patrick, because, I'm hearing a lot. There's been a lot of talk from, for example, the Eat Lancet study, heavily funded by the ultra-processed food industry. You look at all the big players behind that, really trying to turn everybody more into plant-based eating and away from this regenerative agricultural form of buying local foods. And I did an experiment recently where I went keto. So I was just eating high-fat, high-protein foods and no carbs and no sugars.
Brilliant.
And I felt amazing on it. I mean, that's a whole nother story. We can discuss that another day because I felt I lost weight, I had great energy, and it was my blood fats improved. I mean, it was just an extraordinary experiment. But what was fascinating for me, and I did it for nearly a month, was that during that time, I ate nothing out of a packet. Literally nothing. I was eating bacon and eggs for breakfast. Yeah. I was having my green veggies. I was having, fatty meat and fish and eggs and cream and all of that, cheese. But none of it was processed, let alone ultra-processed. Yeah. And, of course, that is finding ground within a lot of the health professionals, particularly certain cardiologists and diabetes experts. But seriously bad news for the big global giants involved in producing food. And there is this kind of conspiracy theory that the whole Eat Lancet debate is being fueled and funded by people who want to sell us more processed foods.
Well, I think this is what I think about this. I think that some of it, I'm not normally a conspiracy theorist.
No,
I
not
know
am I.
that the Eat Lancet, the funding for the Eat Lancet report came from the Wellcome Trust, all of it actually. £3 million it cost.
Wow.
And it all came from the Wellcome Trust. Well, of course, the Wellcome Trust built their great fortune on drug sales, which is, interesting. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with a foundation being set up by a company that made money. But I think that many of the people associated with the Eat Lancet report, there were 37 authors, and really, I would say, if we're honest, none of them were farmers. None of them had knowledge of practice. I mean, Tim Lang, one of the authors, said to me the other day, I used to be a farmer, but I don't count that.
Okay.
I think most of them were
Yeah.
academics, some of whom were probably had some vested interests, not all, and they were probably well-meaning, but I just think they are so disconnected from the reality of farming practice. And I think that the Eat Lancet, I have to say, I think the Eat Lancet report's done a huge amount of harm because it's added to the consumer citizen confusion about what a sustainable diet would look like. They've come up with this ridiculous global diet, as if you could have such a thing as a globalized diet, which would be right. You can't. You need to align your diet to the place where you live.
Yes, and what you're producing, what your soils are able to produce, what your landscape looks like. We know that our microbiome is very different according to different cultures. We've got different tastes, different ways of eating. That's just ludicrous. Maybe they just wanted to standardise it so they can sell us everything out of the same packet.
Well, when you start to drill down, you talk to some of the authors, they say, we didn't agree with this and we didn't agree with that. But the truth is the headline conclusions were you should virtually eat a plant-based diet. If you are going to eat meat, it should be 4 times as much chicken as red meat.
Oh, for heaven's sake. How can they say that?
Well, they just got it wrong. And then the other thing...
But nobody's apologised for it yet. Maybe they will.
And the other thing to say, which I just would like to share with you, I don't know if you know about this definition of red meat, but when people describe red meat, what the current definition, which all the nutritionists use, is all ruminant meat, which is lamb and beef, all pork and all processed meat. So they lump all those together and they call them red meat. Well, frankly, that's scientifically illiterate.
Yeah.
And not only do they have all those different groupings, but they do not differentiate in the red meat which kind of production system it came from. So you could have grain-fed feedlot beef, which is part of the problem, or you could have grass-fed lamb and beef, which is on your farm and part of the solution. There's no differentiation in there. So frankly, you cannot derive any sound scientific conclusions from a report which uses that definition. This is not just that report. All the scientific community use that definition of red meat. It must be stopped. It's unacceptable. It's sloppy science.
Will it be stopped?
I think if you and I and others like us start calling this out, I think it will be stopped.
Well, we're calling it out here. Patrick, we could go on. We do have to bring this to a close, but I would love you to come back because I feel that we've just begun to scratch the surface, and I think there is so much really helpful stuff. The takeaway message is really buy local, check provenance, look at the farming methods, take a deeper look into what we're being sold and what we're being told. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And remember, we're the powerful ones. It's our health. What we eat can transform the future of farming, avoid irreversible climate change, and make us feel really well and part of the solution at the same time.
That has to be a brilliant answer. Thank you so much for being with us. And that's it for today's show. As always, you will find all the links, everything we've talked about, the resources mentioned on today's programme over on lizearlewellbeing.com. There you can also sign up for the free weekly newsletter, which is jam-packed with sustainable, obviously, and healthy recipes with lots of delicious grass-fed beef and lamb recipes as well, and seasonal veggies and salads and something for everybody. Huge thanks to all of you who've left us such lovely reviews. It really does help others to find the show. I'm very grateful. So until the next time we chat, go well. Bye-bye.